This is the Flyerdelphia Podcast, part of sportstalkphilly.com, with Kevin Durso, Rob Riches, and Dan Heening. Hello, Flyers fans, and welcome to another edition of the Flyerdelphia Podcast, part of sportstalkphilly.com. I'm your host, Kevin Durso, joined by Rob Riches this week. And, typically we just kind of jump into the results. We review how the week went, and we go over the results first and then kind of talk about little points from each game. This week, I don't want to just jump into the results. First of all, you probably know the results anyway. Secondly, there's probably a bigger topic at hand here that we need to talk about, and I think we've reached a breaking point in going there and doing this, and I want to reference a few things from throughout the week that were up on the website and things of that nature, just to kind of bring it all full circle here and talk about how at least I got to this point. Rob will chime in on this as well, but I want to kind of start off with this because I want to go back to Monday's game and another slow start and another early penalty and another power play goal allowed, another game where the Flyers allowed the first goal of the game less than 5 minutes in, and just talk about a really pitiful effort from the Flyers in general that night. Look, it's one thing to feel completely defeated in an 8-2 loss in the home opener. This was different. First of all, you had just played your best game of the season the game before. That was that Saturday, the game before. You have a chance to build on a 5-2 win over New Jersey where you kind of withstand all the pressures and you go with the ebbs and flows of a game. It's 2-2 and you get a late goal and you ice the game with two empty netters, but you do everything you have to in your own zone. So two great ways of handling an empty net situation in your own zone, getting an opportunity to move the puck out of the zone and then scoring a goal into an empty net, and you ice the game. That's how that would work. You fail to take advantage of a situation where you could build on that kind of an effort. You started slow. You never shook off the cobwebs before the first period was even over. You start to make a very small push in the second period, can't score, and just as you start to turn momentum slightly in your favor, you give up a goal. And a 1-0 game turns into a 2-0 game. Third period, you're down by 2, still got 20 minutes to go. One goal changes the whole outlook. A turnover by your captain leads to another goal, and the game was over right from that moment, 3-0. Now, the Flyers may have scored shortly after to make it 3-1 and were swarming for the next few minutes. But after about 8 or 9 minutes of that kind of play, the Colorado Avalanche figured things out and get out of the valley of the game that they were in. You have peaks and valleys within the game, and they finished strong. Game over, 4-1 final. On to the next one. This has happened far too many times this season where the team shows up to the rink and isn't ready to play. Ron Hextall even said that this team was donating the first 10 minutes of the game. Donating? Seriously? You can't donate any period of a game, any part of a game. And that's where we're at right now, where the GM has to basically put a call out and say, we can't afford to donate the first 10 minutes of the game. So before we even talk about the games that happened or the games that are coming up, I want to talk about that because if you're donating starts, if you're not prepared, that is a coaching problem. And the only way to correct it is to kind of do what the fans reply to tweets 90% of the time. It's coming down to being the only thing left to do. The Flyers lost JVR, the big free agent pickup, 4 periods into the season. It's funny when people say that the team looks the same as a year ago because of that, because when you do take JVR away, it is the same team. It is literally the exact same team. And it's one thing for the penalty kill to be bad. Yes, this is worse than they were a season ago and what they had a season ago, but they made no improvements and knowingly entered the season like that. So if you didn't expect some things to still be a problem, that's on you as a fan. You saw that there were no improvements. You kind of had a feeling that it was going to take an awful lot to improve that. But the power play, especially the top unit, that's different. When you're not even getting that part of the game going, you have a real problem because, and this is beyond special teams. It's not just the power play not performing. It's not just the penalty kill still being a problem. It goes beyond that. It's turnovers. It's the overall level of play. It's zone exits. It's simple mistakes. And you know what? It's an old and tired act that has the entire fan base apathetic to this team. No one cares about this team right now. And if they do, they are doing so in the same way they have in the past, but also kind of fessing up to the fact that nothing has changed in relatively 4 or 5 years. They're coming to terms with the fact that this is the same thing. It's the same movie. Yeah, I can't turn away from it, and I can't turn it off, and I can't not watch the next time it's on. But it's the same movie, and I know how it's going to start, and I know how it's going to end. So is it time for a change? I think so. Having been a part of the coverage of this team from day one of when Dave Hakstol was hired and understanding Ron Hextall's plan, I got it. I understood the need to build with prospects. I understood that it would take time for the earliest draft picks to reach the NHL. And you know what? The thing is that you can still find a reason to get excited about the team at times because they were winning games. They were making the playoffs. And I think this is one of the things that kind of goes against Dave Hakstol. Reaching the playoffs in his first year created expectations that were going to be difficult to duplicate. When he took a team that was essentially just starting out in the rebuild stages and managed to make the playoffs, it set an expectation like he took a team that no one thought would make the playoffs. If he did that in year one, just wait until the kids get here. Wait until it's year 3 or 4 and everybody's a veteran. It should be go time. And last season, when Provorov and Konechny and Patrick and Gostisbehere and Haig and Sanheim are all on the roster, and it's the same slow start and the same long losing streak that brings everything into question, and the same frantic run to the finish that does happen to result in a playoff appearance, I think people started to get a little less naive to the situation. There were pieces in place that everyone knew would not be returning, but you could count on one hand going into the season the number of players who drew the ire of fans, sometimes for no reason other than existing as a member of the Flyers, and knew they would be a part of the roster. You know, how many players are left? By my count, it's Yuri Laterra, Dale Weiss, Andrew McDonald, and Radko Gudas, if you don't include the 2 goalies. This team was supposed to be better. It was going to be better on paper. It was going to be better in terms of the way that they approached the game because they had more experience from the prospects and the kids who had just started out. They had gone out and made a splash. They got a free agent that was supposed to drive offense and be a shooter, a guy who could put the puck in the net. And the thing is, I will say this. I do appreciate Dave Hakstol being honest. You know, I don't want to hear some spiel about how the effort was there, and if this had gone this way, or this bounce didn't happen, or this doesn't happen, and it's something that they go is out of their control or whatever, that the game is completely different. I don't want to hear that anymore. And at the very least, he is acknowledging that this team has not been good enough in games to be on the winning end. He's acknowledging that the record is where it should be based on the level of play. He's acknowledging that there are things that need to be improved. He's called out veteran players for mistakes without naming them by name, but he's brought up situations where you know that just by watching a replay, a veteran player is the guy at fault. There's no narrative from the organization right now this year about how they're working hard and the effort is there and that the results aren't, but they will be soon because the effort is there. There's none of that. At the same time, Dave Hakstol, to me, sounds completely defeated. His answers lately, while honest, say, I've done everything I know to do to get this team started and in the right direction and out of this slump and be prepared for games the way that they should be, and it's not working. They are not prepared. They struggle fundamentally. They make mistakes on a regular basis. It's essentially amateur level hockey. And the players are certainly not immune to blame. They are the ones who are making the extra pass, making poor decisions, missing coverages, turning the puck over, doing a whole lot of things. They called it pressing after Saturday's game, the loss to the Islanders, and they would be right. Nothing looks natural. Everything looks forced. And when you play like that in front of your home fans, you get 8-2 losses and 4-1 losses and 6-1 losses. So at this point, I don't think we can talk about a matter of if here. The Flyers have not responded well, and after you split the first 8 games of the season, you have lost 3 straight games, each one a little bit progressively worse than the next. And now you are about to head out on a 4-game West Coast trip that will ultimately decide the next move. It's coming down to that. If the Flyers get to 6 or 7 games in a row without a win and start turning in one of these losing streaks that mirrors the 10-game losing streak from a year ago, and it's only October and early November, I don't see how you don't do anything to change it up. I don't see how the coach survives it. I just don't see a way that Dave Hakstol survives this trip if they don't win at least 2 games and get a point in another. They need to get 5 points out of this West Coast trip, bare minimum, to keep everybody's job safe, to keep everything the status quo, and if they don't, something's going to happen. And against the Ducks, Kings, Sharks, and Coyotes, this is going to be a tough task because you can look at the Kings and say the Kings have had a rough start. You can look at the Coyotes and say the Coyotes are still the Coyotes. At the end of the day, those teams could be better than you on any given night because the Islanders came in on Saturday afternoon, losing 4 out of 5 to enter the season, or in their most recent stretch of play in the season, and they walked right through you. They absolutely walked right through you. So it's still going to be a tough task. Before we get much further into it, Rob, let me get your thoughts because we've had an awful lot to break down here, and I'm curious as to what you think because, man, it's a whole lot to process and a whole lot to go over. And quite honestly, we've done this show for a while. We've done this show for the better part of the last 2 years, and we've been writing about this for the better part of 5 to 6 years, if not a little bit more, quite frankly. And I don't know, I don't feel like we've ever, during the entire period of the last 4 years, either one of us have sat there and said, you know what, it's on the coach. It's the coach's fault, and it's time to make a change. But, and I've gone and defended kind of the fact that was always meant to be done as a scapegoat move. If people talked about fire Hakstol, it was something to me that I thought, you're still not solving the problem completely because you're just trying to find a scapegoat. And I would always bring up the players that were there and kind of keep going off of it. And to me, there's nowhere else to hide for him. So I'm curious as to what your thoughts are on Dave Hakstol at this point and what could happen if this doesn't get fixed over the course of a 4-game West Coast trip.
Kev, you know just as well as anybody else that I am a Dave Hakstol guy. I was a fan of the hire from day one. I think he's somebody that, when you look at all the young players that the Flyers were bringing in, he's somebody that obviously could have made a big impact and really helped get the best out of those guys. But I was having a conversation with my grandmother the other day who just celebrated a birthday. Happy birthday, my mom. And, she's one of, we were talking, and, something that I hadn't really thought of before when it comes to Hakstol is, obviously we know what his resume is. All that time spent behind North Dakota's bench, and how he's got that penchant for working with young talent, how he's been able to groom and develop bona fide NHL stars. The problem I think that comes with that territory is when you're working at the college ranks, you're working with guys for only 4 years at a time. You're able to get guys out for you basically just work with guys for 4 years, and then they move on, they move out. They can move on to the NHL. They just leave hockey entirely. It's one of those things where you're not able to work with the long term. You just have really 4 years with guys, and you have to really hope for the best after that. And it's one of those things that when you look at it, it's when you make that transition to the NHL, you're not working with impressionable college kids anymore that are looking for their chance. You're working with grown men basically who are making their mark, who are doing what they can, and it just becomes something where you're not going to at some point what's worked 4 years ago, what's been working earlier on, just kind of loses its luster, loses its touch. That's the argument being made in the NFL right now with Pete Carroll, and the Seattle Seahawks. A lot of those guys have been tuning him out because when you're a college coach and you have a constant roster turnover, you're able to kind of repeat the same platitudes over and over again. And when you have guys that are locked into contracts at the professional level, that just kind of runs out. So it's one of those things that like I kind of like what you touched on, how like I had understood for quite some time that firing Hakstol is something in the middle of the season that could cause a lot more problems than it's really worth. But honestly, I think because it's one of those things where I can absolutely understand firing Hakstol. I mean, the team looks completely listless right now. They just and obviously we've seen them look this way under Hakstol before. You remember last year with that. That 10-game losing streak, and they were able to recover from that and bounce back and find a way to sneak into the playoffs on the final day of the season. Hakstol's been able to get them through some lean times and some dark times, but at some point it's just the team is. You remember the Flyers of 5, 10, 15 years ago where they had that identity. Those were the Philadelphia Flyers. You might be able to beat them, but they're not going to make it easy for you to do that. They're going to come at you. They're going to play a tough style, a physical style. They're going to, run roughshed. And teams never wanted to come to Wells Fargo Center, and Now they come to Wells Fargo Center, and it's awesome because the Flyers are they get the fans just booing them off the ice after the first frickin' period. It becomes something where it's just the Flyers just they're having. I would say that they're having an identity crisis right now, but that would just imply that they have an identity, and they just don't have that right now, and they're looking lost out there every night, and it's just something where at some point, like, how often is that going to happen? Before something changes, before something's able to move on. Now, my main concern, with if they miss the boat on this West Coast trip, and they do end up pulling the trigger and firing Hakstol, is I want to know when push comes to shove, who you end up replacing him with, because obviously there are some names out there, some alluring names that could come to mind. Somebody like, I think Bob Hartley. I think he actually might be in Russia. So that's somebody who I think could help out. Or you look at a Lane Vigneault, which if you want to get Rob Riches fired up on a Flyerdelphia podcast, that's the coaching hire that you make, because that is something that would I might end up in the hospital over that one, because that would just, oh god, that would cause me to become completely untethered. But it's one of those things that you can kind of understand, why fans, why you see it in 90% of Twitter mentions, why you see it all over Facebook, why you're seeing people call for this guy, because they're at a complete low point. They just don't have an identity right now, and it's just like, you look at how often, like, they fall into a rut. It's just it seems like they do it at will, and it's something that like, a lot of that is just on a lack of preparation, and there's only so much that Dave Hakstol can do. Now, like I've said before, I'm not going to go on the record and call him the Chip Kelly of the NHL, because that's just an absolute absurd argument. It's just intellectually offensive, is what it is, frankly. But it's something that's like, I like Hackstall. Like, I've enjoyed him behind the bench. I think he's somebody that could be a decent figure. But I think it's just one of those things that it doesn't work out when you have these guys that are, I think it's just you know coaching style. You can treat grown men like they're in college for only so long before it runs out, and that's just something that the Flyers need to take a long, hard look at. I mean, even if it's something, I don't know if I would necessarily do something in the middle of the season. I think it might be worth revisiting after the season, depending on how the rest of it goes. If Hackstall has that trust from Ron Hextall to kind of right the ship and turn things around, and that is one thing that that we figured out, is that Dave Hakstol is a Ron Hextall guy. Hextall's been very loyal. Kind of ride or die. Kind of general manager. He likes him. He's given him a long leash, and we'll definitely see how he handles this one.
Well, I want to touch on a lot of different things that you just said, Rob, because you kind of took three different angles of where I'm going to go with this, and certainly we have a reason to break down a lot of them. Let's start with this. I actually disagree with your statement that it's a team without an identity, because to me, you can build an identity in many different ways. Most of the time, we try to talk about an identity and go, they're a hardworking team, or it's a team that is physical and brings a competitive edge and a physical edge to a game. That's like we used to say the Flyers' identity was being that physical, hard-nosed team that wouldn't give an inch and that kind of thing. And usually when you talk about team identity, it has a positive spin on it. It's something it's a good quality about you. As far as I'm concerned, you can have an identity that is complete negative. I think the team's identity right now is an inconsistent team that, quite frankly, can't get off to a good enough start, chases the game, and finds a way to fall behind. That's their identity. It doesn't mean it's a good one, and it's one that you want to shake pretty quickly, but that's their identity. Inconsistency. It's, inconsistency and mistakes and lack of fundamentals and not being prepared. It turns into your identity when it's regular, and right now it's regular. So that, I would argue that disagree that they don't have an identity. It's just that it's a very negative identity. Secondly, one of the things that I wanted to touch on was the timing of this. Why would this be a reason, or why would this be the timing of it? And I want to touch on 2 points, one of which is kind of the subject of an article that's going to go up on Monday as well. So you might be listening to this right after we post it on Monday morning, and an article is coming shortly later in the morning. If not, if you're listening to it beyond Monday morning or whatever, you can go back and check the website from Monday to catch this. Here's the thing about head coaches in the Flyers franchise history, if you will. There's kind of a shelf life on head coaches in Flyers history, dating back over the course of the last 24 or 25 years here. There's a number of games coached, and every franchise has this. And the longer, ones in history that have a longer history, sure, they probably got more coaches and more names to go through to find out the rankings here. The Flyers don't really have that much, in a 52-year history. They don't have a lot of coaches to go through. They've had 19 total head coaches, and that includes a double. There's a stint for 2 as well. So technically, there's been 20 different times they've named a new head coach. One time it was the same coach. We're not going to go back that far with everything because that happened in kind of the early days of the team. But this is where I'm trying to go with this. Fred Sherro becomes a head coach over the course of the 70s, coaches for 7 years and a span of 554 games. And that's never going to happen again in this team's history, probably, because coaches in the NHL today don't have that kind of shelf life. They just don't, But then when you consider that the next highest person on the list of all-time games coached is Mike Keenan at 320, which was a total of exactly 4 seasons. The NHL was only playing 80-game seasons at the time. It's telling with the way that the Flyers have gone about with coaches and patience in that time. Mike Keenan coaches the team for 4 seasons, 320 games. In 2 of those years, 1985 and 1987, they were in a Stanley Cup final. So bear that in mind. They go to Paul Holmgren next, 264 games coached. They kind of go back and forth a little bit. Terry Murray got over 200 with his time from the 1994-95 season through the 96-97 season. And then there's a couple more that go through there. Roger Nielsen, if not for health issues, probably would have broken 200. He finished his Flyers tenure at 185 games.
May he rest in peace.
Yeah, absolutely. Ken Hitchcock came on in 2002, or for the 2002-03 season, lasted through the first couple of games of the 2006-07 season, which was, for anybody who probably doesn't remember, was one of the worst, if not, I think, the worst, arguably, in franchise history. Certainly the lowest point total the team's ever had in franchise history in a season. But he lasted 254 games. John Stevens replaced Hitchcock. He lasted 263. Peter Laviolette comes on after John Stevens was fired in December of 2009, takes over. He lasts until the early days of the 2013-14 season. That was a total of 272 games. And then obviously there was the brief stint where Craig Berube took over as the interim coach first, held the title, was named the head coach officially.
Brief, you mean far too long.
Yeah, really. But had it for a second full season, and after they missed the playoffs that year, it was on to a different search that was right after. I believe that second season for Berube was Ron Hextall's first as GM, and then that was where Ron Hextall was kind of given the freedom to approach the head coaching search and try to find a guy who fit what he was going to try to do, and this is where Dave Hakstol entered the picture. Here's the thing about Dave Hakstol's time with the Flyers. Saturday's game was number 257 behind the Flyers bench. He's already passed Ken Hitchcock. Within another month, he will pass John Stevens. 2 months, he'll pass Peter Laviolette. And not to mention that as we go through that list too, Paul Holmgren's going to get passed. Before Mike Keenan's time, he'll pass Pat Quinn. And all of a sudden, he'll go from being 7th on the Flyers list of all-time games coached to 3rd that quickly. And if he lasts through the entire regular season, he'll be 2nd behind Fred Sherro. And the argument that you have to make here is you go, there's nothing wrong with a change in approach. If this is what Ron Hextall wanted to do, you understand it, but you have to look at results, and results are a big part of everything when it comes to these things. If he becomes the 2nd all-time on games coached, 2nd on that list, there's one main difference between Dave Hakstol and the other 7 guys who make up the top 8. Hitchcock being 8th, Hakstol still being 7th for now, and then you go Stevens, Laviolette, Pat Quinn, Paul Holmgren, Mike Keenan, Fred Shero. Paul Holmgren, Ken Hitchcock, and John Stevens each took a team during their tenure. Maybe it was just one, maybe it was multiple, but they each took a team to an Eastern Conference final. Pat Quinn, Mike Keenan, and Peter Laviolette each took a team to a Stanley Cup final. Fred Shero obviously wins the only 2 Stanley Cups in franchise history. And Dave Hakstol could be second on this list in games coached and not have made it past the first round of the playoffs. If this was 5 years ago, I don't think Dave Hakstol would have been the coach at the start of this season because Ed Snyder wanted another cup that badly. If he was still calling the shots like that and a coach, and here's the thing about this is why I'm trying to bring up the timing of it. It's year 4. This is Dave Hakstol's 4th season as the head coach. Usually between 3 and 5, notice how nobody's made it to 5. Or if they did, if you want to be technical, Peter Laviolette was coaching in part of a 5th season, if you will. He coached out the remainder of the 09-10 season, then coached the next 3 in full, and then was the head coach for the start of the 13-14 season and lasted 3 games. But if you want to go off of this, you get to the 3rd or 4th year, and if you're not getting to a point where you're making a bid for winning a Stanley Cup, you were gone because Ed Snyder was done with waiting for it. He wanted a Stanley Cup that bad. He would put money into getting the best players he could and putting the best team he could on paper before there was a salary cap. And even afterwards, you tried what you could. And then if the coach wasn't getting it done, he was the scapegoat. He was the guy who was kicked to the curb if the team had, and especially if a team struggled early in a year. Peter Laviolette lasted 3 games. Ken Hitchcock was fired on October 22nd. And if it wasn't then it was, okay, if you didn't make it past maybe the first month, it was, what happened by the time you got to early December? John Stevens got fired on December 4th. Paul Holmgren in 1991 got fired on December 4th. Craig Ramsey got fired on December 10th. These are guys who you got to a certain point. Craig Ramsey was fired after 28 games in his first full season as head coach. They had a 12-12-4 record, and he was gone. There was a lack of patience when Ed Snyder was still alive and in control of everything and not going through his own health battles and everything like that, and being able to be the owner of the team and a very present figure at home games. And by this point, I don't know that Dave Hakstol would be the head coach just because that's the trend. It's always been thin since Shero because of that. And maybe the days of making a move 5 games into a season are over. You don't want to jump the gun on a guy. If you look at it in Dave Hakstol's case, they came out, they played a great first game in Vegas. They lost in Colorado. They lost terribly in the home opener. They responded with a win in Ottawa, ugly, but it's a win. And they played a really sound game against Vegas and lost 1-0. Okay. They came out, they won a game in a shootout against Florida, though they blew a 5-2 lead. They lost the next game in Columbus. They won a good game against the Devils. Through 8 games, you're kind of going with the roller coaster ride, but it's 4-4. Some of that, at that point you go, it's on the players. At the end of the day, I find it just ironic that the end date for some of these coaches was either in October or December, and it usually means that if a coach was given the benefit of the doubt for struggles that happened in the first 5 to 10 games, by game 25 or 30, if they didn't figure it out and nothing had changed, time was up. This could be the case here if things don't start improving. Saturday was game number 11. By the time the Flyers return home on November 8th, they'll have played 15 games. Is 15 games going to be the time limit? From what I'm seeing and hearing and things like that, there's a chance it might be, because all of a sudden Comcast CEO Dave Scott's making appearances in the press box. He's around. He was there on Saturday, and not to mention, if he's going to be there and probably watch the game, the last thing you want to do in that situation is roll out a 6-1 loss where by the third period you crumble into a million pieces. The Flyers are digging a hole again. This is the biggest problem. They're digging another hole, and they're doing it in 2 different ways because they've also allowed the first goal in 10 of 11 games this year. So they're falling behind in games. They're chasing games. And therefore, as you chase a game, you waste so much energy in the rest, the second 10 minutes of a first period, most of the second period, the early part of a third period. And when you waste that much energy, you don't have the energy for when you need it the most later in the year. This is what happened to the Flyers the 2 times they've made the playoffs under Hakstol, where they've kind of slipped their way in the late part of the season, and they go and they play a team like Washington or Pittsburgh, and you go, they're spent. They're physically spent, or they're fighting injuries that are obtained and happen over the course of an 82-game season and pushing yourself and the grind of an 82-game season, and then they're not on the same level as the opposition. It's the thing that the story is, you don't make the playoffs in October, but you can miss the playoffs in October. And I think that this is what's happening once again. They're digging a hole that they may not be able to get out of. And even if they did make the even if they make the playoffs this year, if they were to make the playoffs in those years past, it would mean that they were spent and they weren't able to do that. So perhaps, the only way you get ahead of the curve here, to get ahead in the playoff race for the whole season, to be better in games this season where you're chasing games. Maybe you just need a new voice. They've had the same head coach for the last 3 seasons. He's in his 4th. They've had 2 of the 3 assistant coaches on staff since 2014, which was Hakstol's first season. Some of them beyond that point. Only one assistant coach has been with the team for less than 4 years. That's Chris Knobloch, hired in 2017. He replaced Joe Mullen. Joe Mullen was an assistant coach for 10 seasons. So there's a lot of familiarity among everything. And after a while, you just wonder how much time you're going to let pass before a lot of things happen. And I don't know that, we're specifically so far focusing this on the head coach. I don't know how much of this is on the head coach and how much of it is on, or it has to do with the head coach. And if that's where the move is going to be made, if it has to do with the assistant coaches, if it has to do with players, you never know. From my understanding is that if the road trip that comes up here, these 4 games in Anaheim, LA, San Jose, and Arizona do not go well, then something is happening after that. The something, though, is not specified. It does not mean that after these 4 games, Dave Hakstol is being fired. It doesn't mean that. It means that something big could happen in terms of a trade that shakes it up a little bit. It means that maybe somebody else goes. But the understanding is that this is the last straw here. They have 4 games left to potentially figure it out. The object at the beginning, maybe before Saturday, was you have 2 months to kind of get it in shape here. If you can't figure it out before the calendar year's over, and you're getting closer to halfway through the season by that point, but if you can't figure it out, then heads are going to start to roll before we even get to the offseason. I am concerned, like you are, Rob, about the idea of the big question is, who would it be the next in line if Dave Hakstol were to get fired? Because that's first of all, it's the thing about an in-season firing is that at that point, there's not a lot of selection left. Things you almost, when the Flyers last did something like this mid-season, which was Peter Laviolette. It was Peter Laviolette early in the year, but when they last really did something like this in the middle of a season beyond the first month, which was John Stevens to Peter Laviolette, it was known that Peter Laviolette was sitting out there as a free agent. He was out there. He was doing TV work. It was known, and it was, if we can get somebody better, and it wasn't like he had nothing to his name. He had the Stanley Cup championship with Carolina to his name. He had his run of success in Carolina. It was something that very clearly made some sense here, and in this case, I don't know that there is anybody on the outside that really makes a lot of sense. Rob mentioned Bob Hartley as a name. Not, I don't know. I'm not overly impressed. Just with that, one of the names that I know is still out there as a free agent is Dave Tippett, who, again, it's hard to judge him based on time in Arizona when Arizona was really just going through a rough spell and is still recovering from it. But
I more or less floated Bob Hartley as a guy because I remember not being overly impressed with his last stint in Calgary. He did miss the playoffs 3 out of 4 years there, but I remember when he guided the Flames to the playoffs in that 2014-15 season with a situation similar to the Flyers where they had a youth movement coming up, a lot of young talent coming through the pipeline, and then I remember they bounced out of the playoffs the next year. Flat out missed it entirely, and I remember that the Flames did can him. They moved on, and I thought, what are they doing? What's Calgary doing right now? That's kind of ridiculous. I think he's a guy that, he's a guy who could make an impact, but you have to think he was somebody that was Whether or not he could not. I mean, it's a similar situation with Calgary, but it's still tough to call it either way. It's just a name that I kind of floated, but
Yeah.
definitely nothing set in stone.
And I don't disagree with that name. That's another one who, if it's available, because truth be told, you're kind of stretching for names. You're looking around, you're stretching for names. You can't even touch on. You'll find a guy and you'll go maybe that, but then you go wait, he's an assistant coach for somebody. You don't pluck an assistant coach from another team in the middle of a season. It doesn't work that way. They're under contract for that season. You can ask permission for interviews beyond a season, which is why you're interviewing a bunch of other people in an off season, because you're allowed to. If at that point you're able to sit there and ask, can we interview this guy? We have a head coaching opening. It's the same way it works in the NFL. When a coach gets fired, a lot of teams go to teams, successful teams in the NFL and go, we like your assistants, or we'd like to interview one of them. And it usually turns into something. I will completely side with you, Rob, on the mention of Alain Vigneault. I know that he is out there and available. That being said, look, I didn't certainly coming into this season, didn't expect this from the Flyers and I certainly didn't expect to be talking about this tonight. I didn't expect to be talking about this at the end of October, 11 games into the season. If the season came to an end and it was virtually the same result, either a very short-lived playoff series or missing the playoffs, I'd understand why we're having this conversation at the end of the year. But I don't think that I would have thought that it would be so bad in October that you were riding so much hope on, or at least some of these coaches and players should be, that you're literally riding so much on this road trip that if it doesn't go well, who knows what's going to happen. But I look at Vigneault and I go, first of all, I just don't see it. I don't see him being a coach that's suited for Philadelphia. I think that
I wouldn't even hire him to change my oil.
I just don't see him being a fit here. And not only do I not see him being a fit here, but I think that in similar fashion, I think he'd get eaten alive by the Philadelphia faithful that are out there. And just look, when being with the Flyers being part of the Metropolitan Division and seeing the Rangers on a regular basis, the Flyers didn't always have the best success against the Rangers while Alain Vigneault was coaching, and that's just a having your number kind of thing. If you watch the Rangers in a bunch of other games, they were just not really good as time went by, and they didn't really recover from that. Like, what I mean when I say that is that you could start to see that Henrik Lundqvist wasn't the Henrik Lundqvist that he was before, and look at what happened last year. It took shipping out tons of big names. They get rid of JT Miller and Ryan McDonough. Dan Girardi goes to Tampa and on a different year. A lot of different guys. And there's more that you can mention too beyond that. And you have to think about that not that first year, but the year, the season before the Flyers fired Craig Berube. So Berube's technically first year, if you will, because let's face it, he coached 79 out of 82 games that year that Laviolette was fired. They played the Rangers in the first round of the playoffs, and they lost the series in 7 games. And the Rangers were playing in the Stanley Cup final that June, and you sit there and you think, like, do you think about that and go, that was just 6 years ago, And obviously Vigneault's not the coach of the Rangers anymore, but do you sit there and think about how that was just, within 5 years, the team had completely dropped off, wasn't making the playoffs, not even close to making the playoffs, and Alain Vigneault was fired. It's an awful lot of stuff that happens in one thing. To me, I thought when I was thinking of that question, because I knew it was a question to consider, there were, I mentioned Dave Tippett, and that was one of the options. I didn't factor in Bob Hartley, but that's a good option too for an outside candidate. To me, there were 2 internal options that would be considered. One is Chris Knobloch, because of the fact that I do think that if Dave Hakstol were to get fired, I think that a lot of things would change to the coaching staff. I think that Ian LaPerriere's time is limited one way or the other, even if Hakstol's isn't. I think Ian LaPerriere's is, and nothing against Gord Murphy, who I do like as a person and a coach, but it's one of those, it's one of those things where, again, performance speaks a lot, and I just don't see them lasting through what happened if there was a coaching change. I think the idea of a coaching change would be a purge, and if anybody lasted, it would be the guy that they essentially plucked right out of the OHL from one of the most successful teams in the OHL to be part of the NHL as an assistant coach. And we kind of talked about it then when they hired him, because he was supposed to be kind of a power play whisperer. And I know this year so far it's been anything but. But Chris Knobloch kind of came with that, almost like that sense that if Hakstol didn't work out, maybe this guy was a successor, because they didn't bring in some low profile junior college or junior hockey level coach. They brought in a guy who had won an OHL championship, had coached the likes of Connor McDavid, among others, a lot of others. And you just started thinking that maybe he was here as a backup plan. And I don't know that he's got a system that would work. I don't know that I like the idea of using him because he's had to work under Dave Hakstol for a while, and it might be too similar. Who knows? The other option internally would be going into the minors and getting Scott Gordon to come up from Lehigh Valley to be the Flyers head coach. Truth be told, Scott Gordon does not have a great track record as an NHL coach. He had fairly average numbers there, but as an AHL coach, he's been very strong. He's been obviously what he's done with the Phantoms in his time has been significant. He took the Phantoms from being kind of a team that didn't have a lot of potential and success and didn't have a lot of players. And as Ron Hextall started to build the pipeline, he started to make work, what he had in his system and all of that. And the Phantoms were in the Eastern Conference Final to a Toronto team that was so good and so deep that I think that it was just a mismatch. They weren't the favorable team on paper, and it kind of came back to prove that in the end, even though there were a good number of close games. So I think that that's the kind of internal options, if you will. If there's external, like I said, Tippett and Hartley sound fine. If you're trying to fill a void, I don't know that I would hire somebody like that. Like I would possibly even consider, if you feel like you have to make a move this year, maybe you see how Knobloch does for the rest of a year, and then you go, you know what, if it doesn't work out, he can stay as an assistant coach, but I'm going to hire a full-time head coach who comes with maybe either a better background, or see what ends up becoming available if other teams fire their coaches, or if there's any assistants that you want to throw into the running here or whatever, So all those things to me apply. And then one of the things I wanted to talk about tonight as well is the idea that, who says it's got to be the coach? Is Ron Hextall safe? You'd assume so, but is he safe? Are any of the players safe? Any, from the top to the bottom? And I don't know that you can answer that question definitively. I do think that,
almost as Jason Kelsey would say, it's the whole team.
Yeah.
The whole team.
I mean, I'll say this. I think Ron Hextall's under some scrutiny because this was his pick for the head coach and nothing seems to be making progress here. But I do also think that if pressed, when you've got the acting team owner, if you will, attending a game and having conversations with Hextall, and Bobby Clark's having conversations with Hextall, and Clarkey obviously still has some connection to the organization in a front office type of role, without being the GM of the team or anything like that. And he's not the president either. He's a senior advisor, I believe. And the thing about it is that, to me, when pushed, I think Ron Hextall will make a move coaching wise if pushed. It's one of these things where if he's given enough rope as a GM to allow his coaching pick to be this guy and to try to be the guy to move them forward, then it's fine. But if the ownership is attending games, not liking the product, and goes, we got to make a change here, this is what it's come down to, you essentially have to. I think that any resistance from Ron Hextall would put his name into the ring too and be like, if you're not going to pull the trigger on this as the GM, then maybe you won't be the GM anymore, And I don't know. I know people probably don't want to see that as much, because the last thing I think people want to do is see Bobby Clark or Paul Holmgren go back into a role like that. But I do think that people don't want to see Dave Hakstol behind the bench if it means that Ron Hextall's got to kind of get a push to do it, then so be it. But I think that if anything continues and Hextall ends up in a spot where he has to take care of it, he's going to take care of it, because he's going to want to keep his own job, because I feel like the ownership group would say that if he's that loyal to Hakstall, then he can go with him. And I think right there it would be turned into a completely different narrative and story and scenario. What I will say also about the possibility of trades is that I do think that if anybody gets traded here, they've been talking about needing a spark. And one of the things about needing a spark so when a roster move was made, when Mikhail Vorobiev goes back to the Phantoms, it's not surprising. Corbin Knight ends up on IR, so they bring up Nicholas Aube-Kubel and Tyrell Goulbourne. And I completely understand why they brought up Aube-Kubel to try to be a spark here. He's had a good start to his AHL season. He had a decent camp. He was one of the last guys to go, kind of. And you know what? He's earned the opportunity from a minor league standpoint. He's played well enough in minor league games. He's earned the opportunity. I don't know why the hell Goulbourne's here, other than to be an extra body potentially, because I don't, if we're going back to the fact that when he made his NHL debut, he laid 2 big hits on St. Louis Blues defensemen to start the shift. And after the second one, the puck rolled on a turnover to Scott Lawton, and he scored a goal. And it made it 1-0 in a game that they went on to win 6-3, I believe. But I don't think it's going to be somebody. I don't think it's going to be something simple. I think you made 2 simple call-ups now. I think the object is that if someone got traded, it's going to be a significant part of the core. And we talked a little bit about this in the offseason when we were talking about Wayne Simmons and his contract and things like that, because we even said it's a contract year for Simmons. If not necessarily even if he's not going to return, but if something goes wrong enough and you want to just try to get something for him and teams know you're going to play the seller card, they might buy that, and it might make Wayne Simmons the most expendable guy among the core because of the contract situation, because you could get him at a time where you have the rest of the year to negotiate and work with him and things like that. You have to throw Claude Giroux and Jake Voracek on this list too. I don't think they would trade Giroux. I think too much of what's going on with Giroux right now comes back to his season a year ago where he had 102 points and made a big statement with where he is in terms of production. I don't think his production has faltered too much. The lack of power play success has hurt him. All things considered too, though, I think he also took the message of the back checking thing against Columbus very seriously, and it turned into a whole thing where it's like, you know what? Let's bring it. It's everything's gonna be done with a certain conviction, and Giroux kind of, I think, when kind of called out for a back check or a turnover or whatever it was when Hakstol was calling a couple of players out and it was done by situation. It wasn't done by name, but I think one of the things with that is that Giroux has kind of changed his approach and is playing a little bit more defensively. He's going a little harder on the back check. He's just not getting chances through the net, and he's getting shots blocked a lot, which also grows frustrating. But I think that they would look both at, both Giroux and Voracek would look at the season and go, we do have to. We have to get it going effective immediately, or this whole thing is going to change in a big way. I'm curious as to your thoughts on if there was a trade by the Flyers, Rob, if there would be anybody in that top 3.
I think honestly it depends. I mean, as far as Ron Hextall is concerned, I mean, I think that we know how he feels about gathering as many picks as he can, but I don't see a trade being realistic. I mean, unless you're talking like a full, if he just decides to basically kind of embrace a full on tank. I mean, I don't see how realistic it is. I mean, especially somebody like Giroux, he's not going anywhere. Voracek's not going anywhere, and it's something where if it comes push to shove, and they do have to, they are able to get something for Wayne Simmons. I think it just gets down to a simple matter of just how well they are performing. If they're staying towards the bottom of the standings. I mean, the way I see it, they're never going to be dead last in the Metro as long as they're playing in the same division as the New York Rangers right now. But
Stranger things, though,
Yeah, I do hear you, but it's something that as far as I see it, I mean, it's something where I think a lot of teams, anything's possible. I mean, all sorts of things can happen. You might want a guy with the intangibles that Wayne Simmons brings. Obviously, he's getting up there in age, and he is coming off a pretty rough injury-plagued season, so he's not exactly the hottest commodity. The reason a lot of teams would want him is for what he brings to the locker room, what he brings to the ice on a day-by-day basis. And I'll tell you, I mean, if if it does get to that point, that may be one of the Saturdays in Philadelphia Flyers history, because the Lane Train is somebody that absolutely knows what it means to wear the winged P. He's somebody that's one of the ultimate Flyers. He's one of kind of a throwback, kind of a rare breed, and it's one of those things that I don't really see them parting with him in any kind of way, unless we get a kind of drastic times call for drastic measures kind of thing.
Yeah, and I mean, well, and that's it's why it's why I don't know that Voracek or Giroux is safe either. You think you're safe until you're not, I guess. And I think that the other thing about being safe is years ago we said the same thing when it came down to well, Mike Richards is going to be safe. He's the captain. Jeff Carter's going to be safe. He's a big time goal scorer. And how quickly they shipped both of them out because they wanted to get a goalie that they thought was going to be the answer to all the problems. But they at what cost? You traded your captain and you traded one of your top goal scorers, who's going on to have great success in LA, by the way. So all those things. I think I find that interesting that you can have your best laid plans and you can sit there and say and you can kind of also sit there and go, those guys would never end up in any other city playing for any other team other than this one, and it may very well turn out to be that situation. You never know. I just think that at this point you're coming down to a stretch where changes are going to be coming, and they're going to be coming in big ways. And I don't know what those ways are going to be. I don't know if it's a head coach. I don't know if it's a player trade. I don't know if it's an assistant coach. I don't know anything about that. What I do know is that I do think that they have, I think the next 4 games are going to tell a lot. I think that at that point, there's also something about the timing of you play 4 games on the West Coast, you go on the road, it's a big deal, and it could be what determines your season. Then all of a sudden you have the next several games at home. The preparation becomes different. You're going to go on between, I believe it happens in November, and then it happens again in, I believe February it happens, where they play 5 home games in a row. But beside, even in December, they have limited number of home games, but there's 3 of them that will be in a row at one point in time. And I think that the 5-game homestand they would have coming up that starts on November 8th is a good marker for everything, just because it provides a window to sort everything out. If it's a trade, if it's a coaching decision, whatever it is, it gives you a little bit of time to sort that out. And I just, it's one of those things that comes back to what we were talking about at the top of the show. When guys aren't responding and guys are kind of down and depressed and, not thinking about too much when it comes to, you don't want to think about hockey. You want to think about something else, because hockey becomes stressful at that point. And it is a little, I'll say this, it's a little stressful watching them sometimes, because you watch a team that has so many bad tendencies and doesn't seem to build on anything, and that can go against you really quickly, and it can put you so far behind that you don't know where else you're going. I found it funny when Rob said it would take a pretty big thing for the Rangers to fall out of that last spot in the Metro or whatever. And it's like, look, don't hold it past them. They played a good competitive game. They lost to LA on Sunday night, but good competitive game, and something where you feel like there's progress. You can take some positives out of it for sure. But yeah, still allowing a little too much or whatever. And I just don't know, it's weird to see all 3 things in place. The coach, the players, the GM, even to an effect. It's weird to see everybody in the same place and so much riding on 4 games, especially, like I said, with that home game, with that home stand coming soon, 5 games, a lot of time, a good, that's a good week and a half at home, I would say. And the Carnival's included in that too. So I wonder, with a lot of stuff coming up, how much more you would go. Thanksgiving's a good marker. Would Thanksgiving be a little too late in this situation? It could very well be. It's just because, I mean, it's one more game than the 5 home games, but what do you say? And 6 games would really make that much of a difference from game 15 to game 21 or 22? I don't know that it would. And I don't know that I would introduce a coach on Black Friday either, but who knows? So it's an awful lot to go through, just because, I mean, Rob, let's just say it this way. We spent the better part of the last hour talking strictly about Dave Hakstol, the head coach position, the idea that players need to get better responses, where this team goes from here. We really didn't touch, you know, not that we had to, but for a change, it wasn't talking about here's what happened in the game. We're going to talk to you about that. There's a topic at hand that needs to be discussed right now. And the article that's going to come out that I mentioned that's coming out on Monday, that's going to talk about all the records that head coaches had, the dates with which they were named and fired a head coach, the number of games they coached, to kind of give perspective on how everything's done. Yeah, those will be great. Those will be something great picture wise later on down the road or whatever. But it's different for us to talk about this, having it be our one topic, because we used to do a big scope of things, and you end up painting a little bit of a prettier picture of what was going on. In this case, I think we came right out and just spoke our minds about it. Did it very, look, Rob and I obviously are buddies too, so we were able to do it cordially, obviously. But maybe because we didn't disagree either. We just know that we're at that point. When people talk to you about where this team is and things like that, or usually they don't even talk to you about like, what do you think of them? It usually just starts with, like something like, dude, they suck. And when are they going to get rid of that head coach, or when is this going to happen? And, the hardest part is being somebody who I don't have the answers to those questions. And I don't really, is there any person who can tell you more about this? I don't know if there's anybody who can. I think we just had to speculate it because it is the talk of everything. And, for once, I think Rob and I both said it at one point in time, that there's, at one point in time during the show night, we both said something about, we've understood this process that they were going on, that Ron Hextall was setting out on, and we've understood why Dave Hakstol was here. And we've watched as people have called for his job in the past and shaken it off a little bit away from our things, because we're not going to get into arguments with people about why they think Hakstol should be fired and why we think he should remain hired, or why there was no change. Most of the time, there wasn't even an argument. It was just something where it was, I'm not talking about that tonight because there's no other answer. You can say fire Hakstol all you want to. We don't have an answer for you. What we can tell, the answer is, don't expect it anytime soon. If that's where you're, if that's going to determine your fandom, don't expect it. If it's a problem, you might want to leave. I don't know, all that kind of thing. And I think that for a change this season, and during the off season, I was a little bit, I was very supportive of that type of thing and all that. I thought this was a great way to just touch on all these things. And we had a long list of topics, and, certainly I kind of got the ball rolling with all the stuff I had to say about the head coach and thinking that they tuned him out a little bit and things like that. So I think that, right now we've touched on that. We've mentioned several times that it's a very different kind of adventure going on. Rob's got his thoughts on this. We're talking about different things, and the fact that we're at this point, they're going on a West Coast trip, and it could be, we feel like we have a timeline. I think, and I don't know if we really believe that we do, but we feel like we do, and we feel like we have to mention it because for a change, I don't think we have anything left to say that defends anything about a Dave Hakstol coach team right now, at least this year, because it seems like everything just goes from bad to worse on a regular basis. So, Rob, did you have any final thoughts you wanted to give on all this? We talked a lot about Dave Hakstol, obviously. We talked a lot about Ron Hextall, the potential of trades, just some of the frustrating things that have been going on the last week or so, well, since the start of the season, really. But the last week has been pretty rough going. So any final thoughts from you, Rob, on anything around this team?
Yeah, I wanted to give you credit for floating Dave Tippett as a potential possibility because he's honestly I thought that he was off the table because I thought that he had a senior executive position with the Coyotes, but I did the math and did the research and he does not. So that's honestly that's not somebody who I wouldn't mind, especially at season's end, or somebody like Sheldon Keefe. You mentioned the Toronto Marlies earlier.
Mm-hmm.
He's their bench boss, led them to a Calder Cup title. So that's something where obviously we'll see how it continues to go throughout the rest of the season. It's something where I expect Ron Hextall to give Dave Hakstol a little bit of a longer leash, but we'll obviously see how that goes, and it depends on just how much rougher things can get. I mean, if I think the collective blood pressure of Flyers fans all over the place would not be very good if they find themselves in another 10-game losing streak this season. But obviously, it's still October. It's still early in the season, and there's plenty of time to right the ship. And we'll see how it goes, and just hope that they can get to that point soon. Interested in seeing what Nicholas Aube-Kubelkin doing his call up this week. That's somebody who I've been pretty high on for a while, and I'm hoping to see what he can bring to the table as well.
I want to throw out, I know Sheldon Keefe was a good name to bring up. The issue I had, I didn't include him now because obviously he's already locked into a position for right now. You can't just pluck him off of an AHL team. There's,
Right.
but I knew, I kind of had forgotten that he didn't get an NHL job this past offseason. There were a lot of openings. And I kind of forgot that he didn't get one. I kind of, I knew he'd been interviewed, I think, several times by several teams, but not actually getting a job. So he just went back. So he could technically be of interest. My only argument to Sheldon Keefe being an option, if it were to be a season's end kind of thing, is that I still kind of have this feeling in me that if you're going to just go and if you're going to tap into the minor leagues, that you've got a coach that's had pretty good success at the AHL level for a little while here and does have an NHL coaching background. Brief and not nearly as successful as his AHL coaching, but I think you've got one in your organization already, and I don't know that they would wait to make the move. I agree with it. I agree with you on.
It's a tough one for sure because it's one of those things that you don't see a lot of organization guys jump in organizations like that in the middle of the season, but it's one of those things where he's going to want a job soon enough because you look at who's in line ahead of him. It's behind the bench in Toronto. It's Mike Babcock. That you want to talk about somebody who's not going anywhere anytime soon. Everybody likes to joke about the volatility of head coaching jobs, but that might be a job that's absolutely safe right now. I mean, he's not going anywhere. So it's if Keefe's going to get his NHL shot, it's going to have to be somewhere else.
Oh yeah, probably without question. I do want to touch on your point about Ron Hextall and the leash size for Dave Hakstol in the coming weeks here. I don't think that anything that would happen mid-season would happen at Hextall's decision only. I think Ron Hextall would come out and tell you that Dave Hakstall's the coach of this team through this entire season, no matter what happens, if it was just his choice. What I do think is happening now is that, let's put it this way. I don't think it's a coincidence that ownership is showing up to a game in October and having a kind of big-time conversation with Ron Hextall and doing it in plain sight so people can see it, at least in the press box. Anybody who's been in the press box, there's a view of the GM's box from where most of us sit. So you can easily see if who's sitting in there. And obviously the usual suspects for most games are obviously Ron Hextall as the GM, but, Chris Pryor will be in there as an assistant GM. And some nights Bobby Clark will sit in there and you'll have guys like that, but otherwise, you don't really typically see anybody different going in there. And here that ownership was there on Saturday. I was not, we weren't in the press box on Saturday just due to other circumstances, but obviously watched the game and did what we had to do from a distance. But I didn't get to see that. And otherwise, I probably would have noticed that, yes, that's who's in there. That's who's having a conversation. You probably read body language a little bit there. I think the pressure is going to start to come from outside sources who, let's face it, I think the core of the problem with anything beyond what the team does for ownership, the core of the problem is going to be how much people care. And if people stop caring to the point where they don't want to get season tickets or they don't want to use their season tickets, or you keep showing up and there's not many people in the stands because resellers couldn't do anything with them either or whatever, I don't think, this team's too proud of their history. This organization's too proud of their history to want to see it get that way. So I think if you start to see the signs of that creeping in, you try to correct it as early as possible. And I truthfully don't think that there is I don't see the negativity coming from anything happening over Dave Hakstol at this point. Like if you said Scott Gordon was the guy who was going to make it, I think people would think it's great. I think Chris Knobloch would be met with a little bit of concern just because people don't really trust the entire coaching staff. But I do think it stems from Dave Hakstol, and I do think there's other coaches who are not faring near as well. Like I find it hard to fault Chris Knobloch for what's going on right now. Their power plays 1 for their last 20. But at the same time, I go, it's partially his only job. He does work with the forwards in other situations as well. And to me, I sit there and I go, that's not just necessarily on him. The head coach needs to get the players ready. The assistant coach kind of maybe coming up with a strategy or something. You never know, but they're doing a little too much or trying to. And if they could get, one and start to get on a roll, it might change things, but that's a far, far way away, so things like that. And that's why I think that you wonder about an outside source here. And I don't know how Scott Gordon would be greeted, but I think an outside source, no matter who it was, would be a little bit well received, just because it's not Dave Hakstol at this point, because I think people are so fed up at that situation. Now, I will say this. I do find it a little interesting that one of the names that we're floating around here, like we said, is Dave Tippett. And it's like, I don't know that they want to go from one Dave to another that quickly, but so be the options, So I think that's the thing, and we'll certainly keep our eyes on everything for the next little while here. When we do next have a show, mind you, the Flyers will still be on that road trip with one game to go. So we'll kind of have to look at how the trip is going so far and consider everything. And who knows what's going to happen once we get back, where the schedule gets back home and everything like that. This could be a crazy next 2 weeks, or less than that even. It could be a crazy 10 days if things don't change. So we will see. And man, I'll tell you, it's just it bothers me to get to this point, because I don't like this. I don't like the coach being a scapegoat. I don't like the coach being a problem. But at the same time, I'm willing to see what that coach is capable of doing. And I've seen some coaches who are very good at their jobs and can take over a team and get them doing what you want them to do pretty quickly. And there's coaches who just never register with a team. And I find it interesting that this is happening 4 years into into Dave Hakstol's time, because of the fact that it never feels like it completely formed to be a good fit for him. But at the same time, he's had his moments, and I think he can say that much. We'll see what happens. That's the big thing. We'll see what happens. It's going to be an interesting 4 games. 3 games will have come and gone by the time we are back, but still could be a crazy, crazy week. So we'll see what happens, and we'll certainly keep an eye on everything throughout the days and weeks, and see if this turns into anything. You never know. So that's going to do it for this episode of the Flyerdelphia Podcast. We want to thank everyone for listening. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast. Again, we are on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, and Spotify. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. Again, we'll get back to the video previews and recaps in the near future. It's not something that we typically do for West Coast games, just because of the late run, specifically the recaps more than anything, but the previews as well. We're going to just let run until games are on again at 7:00. So you'll probably have another one of those when the Flyers return home at 7 or on November 8th with a 7:00 game against Arizona. So that just be on the lookout for all that type of stuff. Also, remember to check us out on SoundCloud as part of the Sports Talk Philly podcast network. Remember that you can listen to us and the rest of the shows on Philly sports through the podcast network that we have. The Phillies Nation podcast on Sports Talk Philly covering the Phillies. The Pick Swap pod covering the Sixers, whose season is also just kind of recently underway. So there's certainly a lot for them to talk about in the coming weeks. And the Kelly Green Boys covering the Eagles. They got a big win against the Jacksonville Jaguars in London on Sunday morning for all of us in the Philadelphia area, but on Sunday, bright and early for sure. But be sure to listen to those as well. Everybody's doing great work, and we certainly are encouraged and thankful to be a part of it. Next week, we will be back in addition to 3 games to look at the three of the 4 Flyers after dark games, if you will. So Anaheim, LA, San Jose, all happening. And of course, we'll look into what happened during those games. We're also going to look and see if anything's changed in our thought process here, or if there's any new rumblings or anything about the possibility of something happening. We'll see. But certainly a lot to cover after next week as well. So for Rob Riches, I'm Kevin Durso. Thank you for tuning in to this week's episode, and please tune in again down the road. This has been the Flyerdelphia Podcast on SportsTalkPhilly.com. This has been the Flyerdelphia Podcast, part of SportsTalkPhilly.com, with Kevin Durso, Rob Riches, and Dan Heaney.